She kept the telescope because no one else wanted it. Not because it held value, not because it meant anything to anyone but the man who had spent 40 years looking through it, but because leaving it behind felt like abandonment. Her brothers had made their positions clear during the reading of the will, their voices sharp with impatience, their eyes already calculating what they would take and what they would discard. The telescope, to them, was clutter, a relic from an old man's lonely life, something that belonged in a donation bin or a landfill, not in their already crowded homes. She had sat quietly at the lawyer's table, her daughter beside her, while her brothers negotiated over property and possessions, as if their uncle had been nothing more than an estate to be liquidated. They spoke in numbers, in market values, in phrases like fair division and equal distribution, that meant nothing when the person being divided had once made them laugh, had once taught them how to skip stones across the lake, had once believed they would care about more than his bank account. The telescope was mentioned almost as an afterthought. The lawyer had read through the list of items with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Furniture, books, the modest savings account, the small house on the edge of town. Her brothers had taken everything practical, everything that could be converted into cash or resold without effort. They divided it with surgical precision, their voices calm, their decisions final. When the telescope came up, her oldest brother, Marcus, had laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly, but one that dismissed without consideration. He said it was worthless, that telescopes like that hadn't been worth anything in decades, that their uncle had probably bought it at a yard sale back in the 70s for $20. Her other brother, Joel, had agreed immediately, as he always did with Marcus. He said it would just take up space, that no one used telescopes anymore, that everything was digital now anyway. The lawyer had looked at her then, his expression neutral but expectant. Someone had to take it. Estate laws required that all items be accounted for, distributed, cleared. Leaving it behind would mean hiring someone to remove it, which would cost money neither brother wanted to spend. She felt their eyes on her, waiting for her to volunteer, to solve this minor inconvenience for them. She thought about saying no. She thought about letting them figure it out themselves, about walking away from this cold room and these cold men, and never looking back. But then she remembered her uncle standing in his backyard on summer nights, adjusting the telescope's angle with careful, patient hands. She remembered him trying to show her the rings of Saturn when she was 9 years old, his voice quiet with wonder, his excitement genuine despite her restless impatience to get back to playing. She said yes, she would take it. Marcus had shrugged, already moving on to the next item. Joel had made a joke about how she'd be calling them in a week, asking for help getting rid of it. Neither of them asked if she had room for it. Neither of them asked if she even wanted it. They assumed she was doing them a favor, solving a problem they didn't want to deal with. The lawyer had made a note in his ledger and moved on. The division continued. Within an hour, everything that had belonged to a man who lived 83 years was separated into piles, assigned to names, reduced to paperwork. She left the office with a single sheet listing her inheritance: 1 telescope, model unknown, condition used, estimated value $0. Her daughter, Emma, who was 12 and perceptive in ways that made lying impossible, asked her why she had taken it. They sat in the car in the parking lot, the afternoon sun harsh against the windshield. She didn't have a good answer. She said something about it being the right thing to do, about not letting everything their uncle cared about disappear into nothing. Emma nodded slowly, her face serious. She asked if they had room for it at home. They didn't. Their apartment was barely large enough for the two of them, cluttered with the accumulated weight of too many compromises and not enough space. But she said they'd make it work. She always said that. It was the only answer she had left. The apartment they lived in was on the third floor of a building that had been scheduled for renovation 3 years earlier. The renovation had never happened. The landlord had raised the rent anyway. She paid it because moving would cost more than staying, because finding another place that would accept a single mother with inconsistent work history was harder than people liked to admit, because exhaustion made decisions for her more often than she wanted to acknowledge. She worked 2 jobs. During the day, she stocked shelves at a grocery store, a position that paid barely above minimum wage and offered no benefits. At night, 3 times a week, she cleaned offices downtown, pushing a vacuum through empty corridors while security guards scrolled through their phones and pretended not to see her. The work was invisible, unnoticed, essential only when it wasn't done. Emma understood more than a 12-year-old should have to. She made her own breakfast before school. She knew which bills got paid first and which ones could wait. She never asked for things they couldn't afford, which meant she asked for almost nothing. That restraint, that premature understanding of limitation, was the thing that hurt most. The telescope arrived 3 days after the will reading. Marcus had hired a moving company to clear out their uncle's house, efficient and impersonal. They dropped the telescope outside her apartment door without knocking, leaving it leaning against the wall like an abandoned piece of furniture. She found it when she came home from her evening shift, wrapped in an old blanket that smelled of dust and time. She stood there in the narrow hallway, looking at it, aware that her neighbors might open their doors at any moment and wonder what she was bringing into the building now. The telescope was larger than she remembered, heavier when she tried to lift it. The tube was metal, painted a faded green that had chipped in places to reveal darker layers beneath. The base was wooden, scarred and worn, its feet wrapped in felt pads that had compressed flat over decades of use. She managed to drag it inside, inch by inch, the base scraping against the door frame. Emma came out of her room, drawn by the noise, and stood watching. She didn't ask what it was. She recognized it immediately, though she had only seen it once, years ago, during a visit to her great-uncle's house that she barely remembered. Together, they maneuvered it into the corner of the living room, the only space that could accommodate its height. It stood there awkwardly, out of place among the mismatched furniture and the boxes they still hadn't unpacked from 2 moves ago. It dominated the room not through grandeur, but through sheer, undeniable presence. Emma asked if she could look through it. She said yes, though she wasn't sure how it worked or if it even still worked. They spent 20 minutes trying to figure out the adjustments, turning knobs that resisted, tilting angles that seemed stuck. The optics were clouded with age. When Emma finally managed to peer through the eyepiece, aiming it vaguely toward the window, she saw nothing but blur. She looked disappointed but didn't complain. She asked if they could fix it, if they could make it work the way it had for their uncle. She wanted to say yes, but the truth was simpler and harder. She didn't know. She didn't know if it could be repaired, didn't know how much that would cost, didn't know if it mattered. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, she sat on the couch and stared at the telescope. It looked more out of place in the darkness, its shape strange against the dim light from the street outside. She thought about her brothers, about how easily they had dismissed it, how quickly they had moved on to things that mattered to them. She thought about her uncle, alone in his house, spending his nights looking at stars that were already gone by the time their light reached him. She wondered what he had seen, not through the telescope, but in his life. What had led him to spend 40 years in solitude, documenting things no one asked him to document, caring about distances that meant nothing to anyone but himself. She wondered if he had been lonely, or if he had chosen that distance deliberately, finding in the vastness of space a kind of peace that people had failed to offer him. The next morning, Marcus called. His voice carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. He asked if she had picked up the telescope, if it was out of the way. She said yes. He said good, that he'd been worried it would become a problem, that he was glad she'd been willing to take care of it. The phrasing bothered her, as if she were performing a service rather than accepting an inheritance. He asked, almost as an afterthought, if she'd noticed anything valuable in the house when she'd visited it years ago. She said no. He seemed satisfied with that. He mentioned that an appraiser had been through the property, that everything had been assessed at fair market value, that the division had been equitable. The word equitable hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. She didn't ask what he meant. She knew. Her brothers had taken everything that mattered financially, everything that could be converted easily, everything that required no effort to possess. She had been left with the one thing no one wanted, and they expected her gratitude for allowing her to have it. Joel called later that afternoon, his tone lighter, but no less condescending. He asked how she was managing, if the telescope was too much trouble. She said it was fine. He laughed and said she should just donate it, that there were organizations that took old equipment, that she didn't need to hold on to it out of sentimentality. He used that word deliberately, sentimentality, as if caring about their uncle's belongings was a weakness rather than respect. She said she'd think about it. She had no intention of thinking about it. She had already decided, though she couldn't have explained why, that the telescope would stay. Emma came home from school that day quieter than usual. She dropped her backpack by the door and sat on the couch, not turning on the television, not reaching for her phone. She looked at the telescope, then at her mother. She asked if Uncle David had been sad. The question surprised her. She sat down beside Emma, trying to find an answer that was true without being cruel. She said she didn't know, that their uncle had been private, that he'd lived the way he wanted to live. Emma nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't convinced. Emma said that when they'd visited him, he'd seemed lonely, not sad exactly, but separate, like he was watching life happen to other people, but wasn't part of it himself. She said he'd been kind to her, patient, but distant, as if he didn't quite know how to be close to anyone anymore. She held Emma's hand, feeling the weight of the observation. Her daughter saw things she didn't, noticed absences she had learned to ignore. She told Emma that some people found peace in solitude, that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. She wasn't sure she believed it, but it was the kindest interpretation she could offer. Emma asked if that was why no one had visited him more often. The question landed with precision. She didn't have an answer. The truth was that she hadn't visited much either. A few times a year, dutiful but infrequent, enough to maintain the appearance of connection without the substance of it. Her uncle had never complained. He had welcomed her when she came and never asked why she stayed away. She realized then, sitting beside her daughter in their cramped apartment with the telescope looming in the corner, that she didn't know her uncle at all. She knew facts, knew his routines, knew that he'd worked as an engineer before retiring, that he'd never married, that he'd spent his evenings charting stars. But she didn't know what he'd thought, what he'd wanted, what he'd regretted. The telescope was supposed to have been a minor inconvenience, a piece of clutter accepted out of obligation. But sitting there, it began to feel like something else, an unanswered question, a presence demanding recognition. Over the following days, she became aware of how often her thoughts returned to it. While stocking shelves, her hands moving on autopilot, she would think about its weight, its age, the careful way her uncle had maintained it. While cleaning offices late at night, the vacuum humming in empty rooms, She would imagine him standing in his backyard, adjusting the angle, searching for clarity in a universe that offered none. Her brothers called again, separately but with the same underlying message. They were concerned, they said, about her keeping something so large in her small apartment. They suggested storage units, donation centers, even the dump. Their concern felt less like care and more like disapproval, as if her decision to keep the telescope was an inconvenience they had not anticipated and did not appreciate. Marcus mentioned that he'd spoken to a friend who dealt in vintage equipment. The friend had said that old telescopes rarely had value unless they were particularly rare or well-maintained. Most ended up in basements or attics, forgotten until estate sales forced someone to deal with them. He said this as if it were helpful information, as if he were guiding her toward the correct decision. Joel was more direct. He said she was being impractical, that she couldn't afford to be sentimental, that she needed to focus on things that mattered. When she asked what he meant, he said simply, her daughter, her job, her future, as if keeping the telescope somehow threatened all of those things. She stopped answering their calls after that. Let them leave messages. Let them assume what they wanted. She owed them nothing, least of all explanations. Emma began spending time near the telescope. She would sit on the floor beside it, doing her homework, occasionally reaching up to touch its surface, tracing the chips in the paint with her finger. She never tried to look through it again, never asked to take it outside. She seemed content to simply be near it, as if the telescope were a monument to something she couldn't quite name, but understood intuitively. One evening, as she was preparing dinner in their narrow kitchen, Emma asked why people gave up on things. The question was abstract enough that it could have meant anything, but she knew what her daughter was really asking. She turned off the stove and sat down at the small table where Emma was working on a math assignment. She said people gave up on things when they stopped seeing value in them, when the effort required to keep something felt greater than the reward it offered. She said it was easier to let go than to fight for what mattered, especially when no one else seemed to care. Emma looked at her with those serious eyes that missed nothing. She asked if that was why her dad had left. The shift was sudden, brutal in its honesty. She took a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. She said, yes, in a way. She said that some people couldn't handle the weight of responsibility, that they chose ease over commitment. She didn't say it with anger, though anger lived beneath the surface. She said it with the exhausted neutrality of someone who had stopped expecting different. Emma nodded, returning her attention to the math problems in front of her. She didn't ask anything else. The conversation settled back into routine, but something had shifted. The telescope, standing silently in the corner, had become a reference point for larger questions, a physical manifestation of choices made and unmade. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself standing in front of the telescope again. She ran her hand along the tube, feeling the cool metal beneath her palm, the rough texture where paint had worn away. She wondered what her uncle had felt touching this same surface, night after night, year after year. The tube was heavier than it looked. She tried to shift its angle slightly, testing its range of motion, and was surprised by how much resistance the mechanism offered. It moved, but grudgingly, as if decades without use had tightened joints and hardened lubricants. She stopped, not wanting to force it, not wanting to break something that had survived this long intact. As she pulled her hand back, her fingers brushed against a seam near the base of the tube, a thin line she hadn't noticed before. She knelt down, bringing her face closer, and examined it in the dim light. It wasn't a crack or damage. It looked intentional, a separation that suggested the tube might be designed to come apart. She didn't pursue it further that night. Exhaustion pulled her back toward bed, toward sleep she knew would be insufficient. But the details stayed with her. A small mystery nested within a larger one. The week passed in its usual rhythm. Work, bills, exhaustion. Emma's school required a permission slip signed for a field trip she couldn't afford. The car made a noise that suggested expensive repairs were approaching. The rent was due, and she was short again, which meant negotiating with the landlord, which meant another month of borrowed time. Her brothers didn't call. The silence felt intentional, as if they had written her off entirely, as if the telescope had been the final test of her judgment, and she had failed by keeping it. She didn't miss their voices. She missed what she had imagined they might become, the family she had hoped they could be. But hope, like so many other things, was a luxury she could no longer afford. On Friday evening, Emma asked if they could try to get the telescope working. She said she'd been reading about astronomy at the library, that she wanted to see the moon the way Uncle David had seen it. Her excitement was genuine, unguarded, in a way that made refusal impossible. They spent an hour trying. She found a manual online for a similar model, followed instructions that assumed tools and knowledge she didn't have. They managed to adjust the focus slightly, to clear some of the cloudiness from the eyepiece. When they aimed it toward the window, toward the sliver of moon visible through the buildings, Emma gasped. It was blurry, imperfect, but it was something. The moon's surface resolved into craters and shadows, texture emerging from what had been a flat disk. Emma's face lit up in a way that made the hour of struggle worthwhile. She asked if Uncle David had seen this every night, if this was what he'd been looking at all those years. She said probably, though she suspected he'd seen much more, much clearer. She said the telescope had been better maintained back then. That time had dulled its precision. But even diminished, it offered something. A glimpse, a reminder that distance didn't mean absence. Emma stayed at the eyepiece until the moon moved beyond their limited view, until the angle became impossible to maintain. When she finally pulled away, her expression was thoughtful, almost solemn. She said she understood why Uncle David had kept looking. She said it made her feel small, but not in a bad way. Small, in a way that made other problems feel smaller too. She hugged her daughter, feeling the thinness of her frame, the fragility that belied her strength. She thought about the telescope standing in their corner, about the man who had looked through it for 40 years, about the brothers who had dismissed it without a second glance. She thought about value, about how it was assigned, about who decided what mattered. And she thought about the seam she had noticed near the base of the tube, the thin line that suggested something more. She didn't examine it that night, but she knew she would. The following Monday brought news that arrived like a stone through glass, sudden and shattering. She received a letter from the grocery store, brief and impersonal, informing her that her position was being eliminated. Budget cuts, they said. Restructuring. The language was corporate, designed to obscure the simple fact that she no longer had a job. She read it twice, standing in the apartment hallway, her hands shaking slightly. The daylight job had been the reliable one, the one with scheduled hours and predictable pay. The cleaning work was erratic, dependent on contracts that came and went. Losing the grocery store position meant losing the foundation she had been building on for 3 years. She walked inside, closed the door, and sat down on the couch. The letter lay in her lap, its words unchanged no matter how many times she read them. Emma was at school. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. The telescope stood in its corner, indifferent to her crisis. She looked at it, feeling a sudden, irrational anger. This was what she had chosen. This was what she had kept when she should have let it go. Her brothers had been right. It was useless. It was taking up space. It was one more thing to worry about when she already had too many things to manage. But beneath the anger was something else. A stubborn resistance. A refusal to accept that keeping the telescope had been a mistake. She couldn't articulate why it mattered, couldn't explain the instinct that had made her say yes when everyone else said no. She only knew that letting it go now would feel like surrender. She spent the afternoon applying for jobs online, filling out applications that required experience she didn't have and education she'd never been able to afford. The process was mechanical, numbing. Hours passed without progress. Every position received hundreds of applicants. Her chances were slim and growing slimmer. With each passing day, she remained unemployed. When Emma came home, she didn't tell her immediately. She waited until after dinner, until homework was done, until her daughter was in that calm space before bed where difficult conversations became possible. She explained it simply, without drama. She said she'd lost one of her jobs, that money would be tight for a while, that they'd figure it out together. Emma's face grew serious, but she didn't panic. She asked what they could do. She suggested cutting back, canceling subscriptions, skipping things they didn't absolutely need. Her daughter was 12, and she was already strategizing survival. The unfairness of that settled heavily. She told Emma not to worry, that she'd find something else, that adults dealt with this kind of thing all the time. Emma nodded, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. She had learned, through experience more reliable than words, that things didn't always work out, that adults couldn't always fix what broke. That night, unable to sleep again, she returned to the telescope. It had become a strange companion in insomnia, a silent presence she found herself drawn to when thoughts became too heavy to carry alone. She knelt beside it, examining the base more closely in the darkness. The seam was there, just as she remembered. She ran her finger along it, feeling where metal met metal, where two parts joined together. She tried turning the tube gently, testing whether it might unscrew. It resisted at first, then gave slightly, suggesting movement was possible, but difficult. She stopped. If the telescope could be disassembled, there might be parts inside that could be damaged by careless handling. She had no expertise, no knowledge of how these things were constructed. Breaking it would be easy. Understanding it would require patience she wasn't sure she had. But curiosity, once awakened, refused to settle. She found herself wondering why the tube would be designed to separate. Maintenance access, perhaps. Cleaning of interior optics, or something else. Something her uncle had known and never explained. The next day, she called Marcus. It was the first time she had initiated contact since the will reading. His surprise was evident in his voice, but he covered it quickly with his usual efficiency. She asked if he knew anything about the telescope, if their uncle had ever mentioned anything unusual about it. Marcus said no, of course not. It was just an old telescope. He asked why she was asking, if something was wrong with it. She said she was curious. That was all. He laughed, the sound dismissive. He said she should really consider getting rid of it, that holding on to junk wouldn't help her situation. He knew. Of course he knew. Word had reached him about her job loss. Small family, smaller town. Information traveled whether you wanted it to or not. He didn't offer help. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He offered advice instead, practical and useless, suggesting she update her resume, network more effectively, consider relocating to where opportunities were better. She ended the call quickly, before the anger building in her chest found words. Her brothers had taken everything of value and left her with nothing, and now they judged her for struggling. The injustice of it burned, but it also clarified something. She owed them nothing. Not explanations, not gratitude, not the performance of making their decisions feel correct. Joel called that evening, his voice carrying false concern. He said he'd heard about her job, that he was sorry, that times were tough for everyone. He asked if she'd reconsidered the telescope, if she wanted him to help remove it. He could take it off her hands. He said, save her the trouble. She said no. He insisted. She said no again, more firmly. He grew frustrated then, his facade of concern cracking. He said she was being stubborn, that she was making things harder for herself, that she needed to be practical. He said the telescope was worthless, that everyone knew it, that she was wasting space and energy on something that mattered to no one. She asked him why he cared. If it was so worthless, why did he want it? The question hung between them, unanswered. Joel changed the subject, said he was trying to help, that she clearly wasn't thinking clearly. She ended the call. Emma was doing homework at the table, but she'd been listening. She looked up, her expression thoughtful. She asked if the uncles wanted the telescope. She said yes, apparently, though she didn't know why. Emma said maybe it wasn't as worthless as they claimed. Maybe they knew something they weren't saying. The thought hadn't occurred to her, but once Emma voiced it, it took hold. Her brothers had been quick to dismiss the telescope, to push it toward her, to insist it had no value. But they'd also been unusually persistent in their suggestions that she get rid of it. That contradiction suggested something. She looked at the telescope with new attention. It stood in its corner, unchanged, patient. If there was something hidden, something her uncle had known and kept quiet, how would she find it? And what would she do if she did? The questions circled through her mind as she lay awake that night, as she calculated bills she couldn't pay and opportunities that wouldn't come. The telescope had been an inheritance no one wanted, a burden accepted out of obligation. But perhaps it was something else. Perhaps her uncle, quiet and private and impossibly distant, had left her something that mattered after all. She didn't know yet, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was going to find out. The resolve that had formed quietly over restless nights found its expression in action. She began with research, the kind that could be done in stolen moments between responsibilities. While Emma was at school and before she left for her evening cleaning shift, she sat with her laptop and learned about telescopes, about how they were constructed, how they functioned, what components made them valuable or obsolete. Most of what she found confirmed what her brothers had said. Old telescopes, unless rare or historically significant, had little monetary value. The optics degraded, the mechanisms wore out, and technology had advanced so far beyond them that collectors rarely took interest. A telescope from the 1970s, which her uncle's appeared to be, would be worth perhaps a few $100s if it were in pristine condition. Hers was not. But she also learned about maintenance. Telescopes of that era were built to be serviceable. The tubes often came apart to allow cleaning of the primary mirror, adjustment of alignment, replacement of worn components. The seam, she had noticed, was likely intentional, a design feature rather than damage. She found a forum for amateur astronomers, created an account, and posted a careful question. She described the model as best she could from its external features, asked about disassembly procedures. The responses came slowly, spread over days, from people who treated such questions with the seriousness of those who had spent lifetimes caring about precision. One user, who identified himself only as Stargazer, 67, provided detailed instructions. He warned her to be careful, to work slowly, to document the position of every component before removing anything. He explained that reassembly could be tricky, that alignment was critical, that rushing would cause more damage than it repaired. She printed the instructions, studied them, until she understood the sequence, then waited for a weekend when she would have uninterrupted time. Emma agreed to spend Saturday at a friend's house. an arrangement that required reciprocation she couldn't afford but accepted anyway. Some things couldn't be postponed. Saturday morning arrived cold and grey. She made coffee, cleared space in the living room, and laid out the few tools she owned: a screwdriver, an adjustable wrench, clean towels to protect surfaces. The instructions warned against forcing anything, advised that decades of settling might make parts resistant. She began with the base, checking the manual mounting points, familiarizing herself with how the telescope connected to its stand. Everything was tighter than expected, screws frozen by time and disuse. She applied steady pressure, feeling metal resist, then gradually yield. Each screw removed felt like progress, like moving towards something important, even though she didn't yet know what. The tube separated from its mount with a slow, grinding sound. She lowered it carefully onto the towels she'd spread across the floor, aware that dropping it would end whatever investigation she'd begun. The weight surprised her still, the solid density of its construction. This was not a cheap instrument. Her uncle had invested in something built to last. She examined the seam more closely now that the tube was accessible. It was near the center, a joining of two sections held by a series of small bolts. She followed the instructions Stargazer 67 had provided, loosening each bolt incrementally, moving in sequence to prevent stress fractures. The resistance was significant. Time had effectively welded the sections together through oxidation and compression. She worked slowly, patiently, letting each bolt give gradually, rather than forcing it. Sweat formed despite the cold room. Her hands ached from the unfamiliar strain. After an hour, the final bolt loosened. She set it aside with the others, small pieces of metal that would need to be returned to their exact positions if she hoped to reassemble this later. The tube lay before her in two pieces, still connected but ready to separate. She paused then, aware that opening it would change something. Until this moment, the telescope had been exactly what it appeared to be: an old instrument, a relic of her uncle's hobby. Nothing more than the brothers had claimed. But the instant she pulled these sections apart, she would know whether their dismissal had been accurate or whether something else waited inside. Her phone buzzed. Joel calling. She ignored it. Whatever he wanted could wait. Her attention was here, focused on this moment, on this choice. She grasped both sections firmly and pulled. They resisted, then separated with a soft scraping sound. The interior of the tube revealed itself slowly. Optical components at both ends, mirrors and lenses, mounted precisely, untouched by her disassembly. Between them, however, was space, hollow and dark. She tilted the tube, letting light from the window fall inside. The cavity was cylindrical, perhaps 8 inches in diameter, running most of the tube's length. It should have been empty, or at most contained minimal support struts for the optical components. Instead, she saw something else. A shape, dark and distinct against the lighter interior metal. Not a malfunction, not damage. Something placed there deliberately. Her pulse quickened. She set the tube down carefully and reached for her phone, turning on its flashlight function. She angled the beam inside, moving it slowly to illuminate what lay within. Gold, or something that looked like gold. Objects wrapped in cloth, packed tightly within the tube's hollow core. She could see the edges, the regular shapes, the careful arrangement that spoke of intention rather than accident. She sat back, her breath catching. This was not telescope maintenance. This was concealment. Her uncle had modified the instrument, had transformed it from a tool of observation into a container. The telescope everyone had dismissed, that her brothers had mocked her for keeping, held something they had never imagined. She wanted to reach inside immediately, to confirm what her eyes were telling her, but caution held her back. If these objects were valuable, If they were what they appeared to be, then removing them carelessly could cause damage. And if they were truly valuable, then she needed to understand what she was dealing with before anyone else learned of their existence. She took photographs first, documenting the tube's interior from multiple angles, capturing how the objects were packed, how the cloth protected them. Then, slowly, carefully, she reached inside. The first bundle was deeper than she expected, her arm extending into the tube past her elbow. Her fingers closed around fabric, something substantial beneath it. She pulled gently, easing it toward the opening. The weight confirmed her suspicion. This was heavy, far heavier than cloth alone. She extracted it completely and set it on the towel. The fabric was old, yellowed, wrapped multiple times. She unwound it slowly, layer after layer, until the content revealed itself fully. A bar, rectangular, perhaps 6 inches long, 2 inches wide, 1 inch thick. The surface was dull, tarnished, but the color was unmistakable. Gold. And stamped on its face were markings she recognized from movies and photographs, but had never seen in person. Purity certification, serial numbers, official insignia. This was not jewelry melted down and reformed. This was a manufactured bar, created for investment, for storage of wealth in its most concentrated form. She had read about such things, knew they existed, but had never imagined holding one. She reached into the tube again. Another bundle, similar size and weight, then another. She worked methodically, extracting each one, unwrapping it, confirming what she already knew but couldn't quite believe. 6 bars in total, each identical to the first, each bearing the same official markings, each impossibly real beneath her hands. When the tube was empty, when all 6 bars lay arranged on the towel before her, she sat motionless. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing, to reconcile the dusty telescope in the corner with the fortune spread across her floor. She thought of her uncle, imagined him carefully placing these bars inside the tube, wrapping each one, sealing the telescope, then spending 40 years using it as if it were ordinary. The deception was extraordinary, not malicious, but protective. He had hidden wealth in the one place no one would think to look, within an object everyone would assume was worthless. Her hands shook as she picked up one bar, feeling its weight again, its density. If these were genuine, and she saw no reason they wouldn't be, then their value was considerable. Gold prices fluctuated, but even at conservative estimates, a single bar was worth tens of thousands. 6 would be transformative. She thought of Emma, of the bills unpaid, of the jobs lost, and the future uncertain. She thought of the apartment that barely contained them, of the car that barely ran, of every compromise she'd made because she had no other choice. This changed everything. If these bars were real, if they could be authenticated and sold, then her daughter's life could become something more than survival. But the thought that followed was darker. Her brothers, they had wanted the telescope. Joel's call earlier, his insistence that she get rid of it, his frustration when she refused. Had they known or suspected? The timing felt too convenient, their pressure too persistent. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. Traffic passed, oblivious. Life continued in its ordinary patterns, while she stood in her apartment holding more wealth than she'd seen in her entire life. The disconnect was dizzying. Her phone buzzed again. Another call from Joel. She answered this time, keeping her voice steady. He asked how she was doing, if she'd reconsidered his offer to help with the telescope. She said she was fine. The telescope was fine. She didn't need his help. He persisted, said he'd been thinking about it, that maybe it had some historical value after all, that he knew a collector who might be interested. The lie was obvious now, illuminated by what she knew. He didn't want to help. He wanted the telescope. And whatever collector he mentioned was likely himself, or Marcus, or someone working on their behalf. They had suspected something. Perhaps not the exact truth, but enough to make them want what they'd pretended to dismiss. She told him she'd think about it and ended the call. Her hands were still shaking. She looked down at the bars, their surface catching the light, their weight impossible to ignore. She was holding the reason her brothers had been so eager to have her dispose of the telescope. They'd wanted it gone before she discovered what it contained. Anger flared, hot and clarifying. They had manipulated her, had treated her like an obstacle to be managed, had dismissed her while knowing or suspecting that what she held had value they wanted for themselves. The realization transformed everything. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about family members who had always looked down on her, who had treated her struggle as evidence of failure rather than circumstance. She gathered the bars carefully and rewrapped them. She couldn't leave them exposed, couldn't risk anyone seeing them if they somehow gained access to her apartment. The telescope tube had protected them for decades. It would continue to do so until she decided what came next. She reassembled the telescope slowly, following the documentation she'd created in reverse. Each bolt returned to its position, each component aligned as it had been before. The process took hours, but when she finished, the telescope looked exactly as it had that morning, innocent and ordinary, holding its secret without revelation. Emma came home in the late afternoon, full of stories about her friend's house, about games played and movies watched. She asked if her mother had figured out the telescope, if she'd managed to make it work better. She said not yet, but she was making progress. It wasn't a lie. She was making progress, just not the kind her daughter imagined. That night, after Emma was asleep, she sat with her laptop and began researching gold authentication, valuation, and sale. The process was more complex than she'd anticipated. Gold bars of this type required certification, proper documentation to prove their origin and purity. Selling them informally would be difficult and potentially dangerous. The legal market demanded transparency, but transparency meant questions. Where had these bars come from? How had her uncle acquired them? Were they legally owned, or had they been obtained through means that would complicate ownership transfer? She had no answers, only the bars themselves and a will that made no mention of them. She thought about calling a lawyer, about seeking professional advice. But lawyers cost money, and any consultation would create a record of the discovery. If her brothers learned what she'd found before she'd secured her claim, they would fight her. They would argue that the bars were part of the estate, that they deserved their share, that the telescope's contents should have been disclosed during the will reading. They would probably be right, legally, but morally, they had forfeited any claim through their dismissal and manipulation. She had kept the telescope not because she'd known what it contained, but because she'd chosen to honor their uncle's memory when they hadn't. That choice deserved recognition. She didn't sleep. She spent the night moving between research and calculation, between hope and caution, between the realization that her problems might be solved and the awareness that new, more complicated problems were emerging. By the time dawn arrived, she had made a decision. She would authenticate the bars first, privately, through a reputable service that could confirm their legitimacy without requiring extensive disclosure. Once she knew for certain what she held, she would consult with a lawyer specializing in estate law, and she would do all of this quickly, before her brother's suspicions grew strong enough to prompt action. The fortune in her living room, hidden within an old telescope everyone had dismissed, represented more than money. It represented the possibility of a different future, One where her daughter wouldn't have to strategize survival, where she wouldn't have to choose between rent and food, where exhaustion wasn't the constant background state of existence. Her uncle had left her this, not by accident, not carelessly, but intentionally. He had chosen the one object no one else would want, had ensured it would come to her, had trusted that she would discover what it held. The gift was extraordinary, but so was the burden. Everything that followed would depend on decisions she made in the days ahead, on choices between caution and action, between silence and disclosure. She stood and walked to the telescope once more, resting her hand on its cool surface. Somewhere inside its ordinary exterior lay wealth that could transform everything. And somewhere beyond her apartment walls, her brothers waited, unaware that what they'd dismissed had already slipped beyond their reach. Morning arrived with the weight of decision. She had spent what remained of the night in restless planning, her mind moving through scenarios, calculating risks, trying to map a path forward that wouldn't expose her vulnerability before she'd secured her position. The bars lay hidden within the telescope, invisible to anyone who might enter the apartment, but their presence transformed every corner of the room. She was acutely aware that what had been a safe, ordinary space now contained something that could change everything or destroy it entirely, depending on the choices she made in the hours ahead. Emma woke earlier than usual, drawn into the kitchen by sounds her mother couldn't contain. She made toast, poured juice, her movements quiet, with a child's instinct not to disturb something fragile. She asked if everything was all right. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of all the times things had not been all right, all the crises weathered and survived, but never quite overcome. She told Emma yes, that she was just thinking about job applications, about next steps. It wasn't entirely a lie. She was thinking about next steps, though not the ones Emma imagined. She wanted to tell her daughter everything, to share the discovery that had shifted their entire situation, but caution held her back. 12-year-olds, no matter how mature, couldn't be expected to carry secrets this heavy. And until she understood the legal position, until she knew with certainty that the gold was hers to claim, telling Emma would only burden her with hopes that might still be taken away. After Emma left for school, she made the first call. The number belonged to a precious metals authentication service 3 hours away, far enough that she was unlikely to encounter anyone who knew her or her family, close enough that she could drive there and return in a single day. The company's website was professional, established, with client testimonials and credentials that suggested legitimacy. The receptionist who answered was efficient without being warm. She explained she'd inherited some items she needed authenticated, that she wanted the process handled confidentially, that she was willing to pay for expedited service. There was a pause, the sound of keys clicking as information was entered into a system, then confirmation. They could see her that afternoon if she arrived by 2 o'clock. The cost would be substantial, a day's wages from a job she no longer had, but necessary. She confirmed the appointment, ended the call, and immediately felt the anxiety of the commitment. She was moving forward now, transforming suspicion into action, stepping beyond the safety of uncertainty. Once the bars were authenticated, once professionals confirmed their value, there would be no retreating to the simplicity of ignorance. She called the cleaning company next, explained she needed to take a personal day. They were not pleased. Coverage at short notice was difficult, they said, and reliability mattered in this industry. She apologized, promised it wouldn't happen again, knew even as she said it that her position there was now less secure. One more thing to worry about, one more consequence cascading from choices she hadn't asked to make. The drive took longer than anticipated. Traffic was heavy leaving the city, thick with mid-morning commerce that crawled through intersections and stalled at construction zones. She used the time to practice what she would say, how she would present the bars without revealing too much. She was a niece, settling an estate. The items had been stored away, only recently discovered. She needed to know their authenticity and value before proceeding with distribution. Simple, believable, close enough to truth that she wouldn't stumble over details. The authentication service occupied a nondescript building in a commercial district designed for function rather than impression. Gray concrete, tinted windows, a parking lot half empty. She sat in her car for several minutes after arriving, the telescope tube wrapped in blankets on the back seat, visible but innocuous. Once she carried it inside, once professionals examined what it contained, there would be no going back. She gathered the tube and walked toward the entrance, her stride deliberately casual. Inside, the reception area was small and Spartan. A counter separated visitors from the offices beyond. Security cameras watched from corners, their red lights steady. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses hanging from a chain, looked up from her computer screen. She gave her name. The receptionist checked a list, nodded, and made a brief phone call. Within moments, a man emerged from the back offices. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with the careful, assessing look of someone trained to recognize deception. He introduced himself as Daniel Reeves, senior authenticator. His handshake was firm, professional, completely impersonal. He led her to a small examination room, the walls lined with equipment she didn't recognize, the center dominated by a stainless steel table. He gestured for her to place the tube on the table. She did so, then stepped back, watching as he approached it with the caution of someone who understood that appearances could mislead. He asked about the items. She explained they were gold bars, that they'd been stored inside the telescope for an unknown period, that she needed confirmation of their authenticity and current market value. He asked how many. She said 6. His expression shifted slightly, not enough to suggest surprise, but enough to indicate he was recalculating his approach. He suggested opening the telescope there, in the room, under controlled conditions. She agreed. Together, they disassembled it, following the same process she'd completed yesterday, but with greater speed born of his experience with unusual containers. When the tube separated and the interior revealed the wrapped bundles, he paused briefly, then continued with methodical calm. Each bar was removed, unwrapped, and placed on the table. Daniel examined them without touching, his eyes moving across surfaces, markings, edges. He photographed each bar from multiple angles, recording serial numbers, maker's marks, every detail that would allow verification against databases and historical records. Then he took measurements, weight first, using a precision scale that displayed numbers to 3 decimal places. Dimensions next, calipers providing tolerances that would reveal inconsistencies if the bars were counterfeit. The process took time, each test performed twice to ensure accuracy. While he worked, she stood near the wall, trying to appear patient rather than anxious. The room's silence was broken only by the soft sounds of instruments against metal, the click of cameras, Daniel's occasional notes, spoken into a recording device. She understood she was watching her future being determined by calibrations and comparisons, by data that cared nothing for her need or her uncle's intentions. After the physical examinations, Daniel moved to chemical testing. He explained the process as he worked, his voice neutral, educational. He would take tiny samples from inconspicuous areas, test them for purity, compare results against the stated specifications stamped on each bar. Genuine gold would match its certification exactly. Forgeries almost always revealed themselves through inconsistencies. She watched the reagents change color, watched Daniel's face for any reaction. He gave nothing away. His focus remained on the process, on documentation, on building a record that would support whatever conclusion he reached. Time stretched. What should have been simple verification became an endurance test, each minute accumulating like weight. Finally, he set down his tools and turned to face her. His expression was carefully neutral, but something in his eyes suggested the news wouldn't be simple. He asked her to sit. She did, her chest tightening, preparing for disappointment, for the revelation that she'd built hopes on illusions. Instead, he told her the bars were genuine, all 6. Their purity matched their certification. The serial numbers corresponded to bars manufactured by a reputable mint in the late 1960s. Each bar contained exactly 1 kilogram of gold. Based on current market rates, their total value was approximately $296 million. The number didn't register at first. She heard it, processed the words, but they refused to mean what they meant. She asked him to repeat it. He did, slower this time, ensuring clarity. 296 million, not thousand, million. She felt the room tilt slightly, her equilibrium disturbed by information too large to accommodate. This wasn't the comfortable fortune she'd imagined, wasn't enough to solve immediate problems and provide breathing room. This was generational wealth, life-altering in ways that transcended her ability to conceptualize. Daniel continued explaining. The bar's age worked in her favor. Older gold, properly certified, commanded premium prices among collectors and investors. The fact that they'd been stored carefully, protected from damage or degradation, maintained their value completely. And gold prices had risen substantially since the 60s, meaning these bars were worth many times their original purchase price. She managed to ask about documentation, about proof of ownership. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, becoming more cautious. That, he said, was more complicated. The bars themselves were legitimate, but their provenance, their chain of custody, was unclear. To sell them legally, she would need to establish how they were acquired, prove they weren't stolen or obtained through illegal means. He asked about her uncle. She explained he'd been an engineer, quiet, private, had worked for various companies over the course of his career. Daniel made notes. He suggested her uncle might have purchased the bars as an investment, that such purchases weren't uncommon among people who lived through economic instability, but proving that decades later, without receipts or records, would require legal assistance. He offered a contact, a lawyer who specialized in estate law and asset recovery, someone experienced in navigating the complex intersection of inheritance and high-value property. She took the card he offered, her hand trembling slightly. Everything was happening too fast. Yesterday, she'd been unemployed and desperate. Today, she was sitting in a sterile room, discussing how to legally claim a fortune she still couldn't quite believe existed. Daniel helped her rewrap the bars and secure them in the telescope tube. He provided documentation of his findings, signed and certified, suitable for legal proceedings. He also, with visible reluctance, mentioned that discoveries of this magnitude attracted attention. He was legally obligated to report certain transactions, though this consultation fell below threshold requirements. Still, he advised her to move quickly, to secure legal representation before word spread through the specialized networks that connected dealers, collectors, and those who tracked the movement of significant assets. She thanked him, paid the authentication fee with a credit card that barely had room for the charge, and left. The drive home passed in a blur. Her mind couldn't settle, couldn't process what she knew. The telescope sitting in her back seat, that ordinary object everyone had dismissed, contained enough wealth to solve every problem she'd ever had and create 100 new ones she'd never imagined facing. Traffic slowed approaching the city. She used the delay to think through immediate steps. First, contact the lawyer Daniel had recommended. Second, secure better storage for the bars. She couldn't leave them in her apartment, where any break-in or accident could result in catastrophic loss. Third, and most difficult, maintain absolute secrecy. If her brothers learned what she'd discovered before she'd legally secured her claim, they would act. Their earlier pressure to remove the telescope now made perfect sense. They'd suspected something, and her refusal to cooperate had frustrated plans they'd never articulated. She arrived home in the late afternoon. Emma wasn't back from school yet. She carried the telescope inside quickly, aware of neighbors' windows, of the possibility that someone might notice unusual activity and mention it casually in conversation that could travel unpredictably. Inside, she restored the telescope to its corner, its appearance unchanged, its secret intact. She called the lawyer immediately. The receptionist, who answered, was polished, professional, asked about the nature of the matter. She explained she needed advice regarding an inherited asset, that the situation was sensitive and urgent. There was a pause, checking of schedules, then an offer. The lawyer, Michelle Torres, could see her tomorrow morning. The consultation would cost $300 for the first hour. She agreed without hesitation. Money, which had always been the limiting factor in every decision, was no longer the issue. Understanding what came next was. Emma came home carrying questions about a school project, about materials she needed, about permission slips and deadlines. Normal things, ordinary concerns that belonged to a world where the largest problems were manageable. She helped with homework, made dinner, maintained the routines that kept them anchored. But beneath the surface, her mind was already elsewhere, calculating, planning, trying to anticipate the dozens of ways this situation could develop. After Emma went to bed, she sat with her laptop and began researching Michelle Torres. The lawyer's website was impressive. Credentials from respected institutions, client testimonials describing successful resolutions of complex estate disputes. She specialized in high-value asset recovery, in cases where inheritances were contested or ownership was unclear. This was exactly what she needed, someone who understood the legal intricacies and could navigate them without unnecessary exposure. She also researched gold storage, security services, options for protecting assets worth hundreds of millions. The numbers still didn't feel real, but the practical requirements did. She couldn't keep the bars in her apartment. Even hidden, they represented a risk she couldn't justify now that she knew their value. Her phone rang. Joel. She stared at the screen, watching his name pulse with each ring. Then let it go to voicemail. She wasn't ready to talk to him yet, wasn't prepared to maintain the fiction that nothing had changed. He left a message, his voice friendly but persistent. He said he'd been thinking more about the telescope, that he really believed there might be some collector interest, that he wanted to help her explore options. The lie was transparent now, almost insulting in its obviousness. She didn't return the call. Instead, she sent a brief text saying she was busy, would talk to him later. Simple, non-committal, buying time. He responded immediately, pressing for a phone conversation, for a time they could meet. She didn't reply. Let him wonder, let him worry that his window of opportunity was closing. Sleep was impossible. She lay in bed watching shadows from streetlights move across the ceiling, her mind cycling through scenarios. In some, everything worked smoothly. The lawyer secured her claim. The bars were sold legally. She and Emma began a new life, free from the constant pressure of survival. In others, complications emerged. Her brothers challenged ownership, legal proceedings dragged on, costs mounted, until the fortune that should have solved everything became a burden that created more problems than it resolved. By morning, exhaustion had settled into her bones, but clarity had emerged as well. Whatever happened, she was committed now. The discovery couldn't be undiscovered. The knowledge couldn't be forgotten. She would either claim what her uncle had left her, or she would fight to understand why it had been taken away. The lawyer's office was downtown, occupying several floors of a building that projected confidence through architecture, glass and steel rising clean against the morning sky. She felt acutely aware of her appearance as she entered, of her worn coat and practical shoes, of how obviously she didn't belong in spaces designed for wealth, but she'd been looked down on before. She was accustomed to not fitting, to being underestimated. Michelle Torres was younger than her website photo suggested, perhaps mid-40s, with sharp eyes that assessed quickly and thoroughly. Her handshake was brief but not dismissive. She led the way to a conference room dominated by a table too large for two people, closed the door, and sat with the posture of someone prepared to hear anything. She explained the situation carefully, starting with the will reading, the dismissal by her brothers, her decision to keep the telescope. Michelle listened without interrupting, her expression neutral. When she reached the discovery, the disassembly, the authentication results, Michelle's focus intensified. She asked pointed questions about the will's specific language, about whether the telescope had been itemized separately or grouped with general contents, about any communication with her brothers that might suggest they knew or suspected what the telescope contained. Each question revealed legal dimensions she hadn't considered, implications that layered complexity onto what should have been simple inheritance. Michelle explained the core issue. The bars had not been explicitly mentioned in the will. Legally, they could be considered part of the general estate, subject to division among all heirs. Her brothers could argue they'd been deceived, that the telescope's value had been deliberately obscured, that the distribution had been inequitable because critical information was withheld. But, Michelle continued, there were counter-arguments. The telescope had been specifically itemized and allocated. Its contents, regardless of value, were part of that allocation. More importantly, if her brothers had pressured her to dispose of it after the will reading, if they demonstrated knowledge or suspicion about hidden value, then their claims to equitable distribution would be weakened by their own attempt at manipulation. She produced her phone, showed Michelle the texts from Joel, played the voicemail from that morning. Michelle reviewed them carefully, made notes. This, she said, was useful. It suggested intent to mislead, possibly to defraud her of rightful property. It wouldn't guarantee success in court if things reached that point, but it strengthened her position considerably. The consultation stretched beyond an hour, then two. Michelle outlined a strategy. First, formal documentation, securing the bars in professional storage under her name alone. Second, a preemptive filing, establishing her claim before her brothers could contest it. Third, a quiet investigation into her uncle's finances, searching for any records that might prove how and when he'd acquired the gold. If they could establish legitimate purchase, if they could document that he'd intended the telescope and its contents for her specifically, then her position would be nearly unassailable. The costs were substantial: legal fees, storage fees, investigation expenses. Michelle estimated initial costs could reach $50,000, with more required if litigation developed. The money would need to come from somewhere. She couldn't access the gold's value until ownership was confirmed, but she also couldn't confirm ownership without spending money she didn't have. Michelle offered a solution. She knew investment firms that specialized in high-value asset cases that would provide funding against future settlement. The terms weren't generous, but they were available. Or, Michelle suggested more quietly, she could sell one bar independently, discreetly, through channels that didn't require full documentation. The proceeds would cover all legal costs, with substantial remaining. The approach carried risk, she cautioned. Undocumented sales could complicate later claims. But pragmatically, it was the fastest path forward. She didn't answer immediately. Selling even one bar meant accepting that some of what her uncle had left might be lost to necessity. But keeping all of it while losing the legal battle would be worse. She told Michelle to proceed with whatever arrangements were necessary. She would take the risk. Over the following days, the machinery of law and finance engaged. Michelle connected her with a firm willing to purchase one bar privately, no questions asked, for below market value but sufficient for her needs. The transaction happened in a secure facility, the bar examined, authenticated independently, and exchanged for a wire transfer that appeared in an account Michelle had helped her establish. The remaining 5 bars went into high-security storage, accessible only through her authorization, protected by systems designed specifically for assets of extreme value. She received documentation, insurance riders, protocols for retrieval. The bars were no longer in her apartment, no longer vulnerable to accident or theft, but she couldn't shake the awareness that they were also no longer entirely under her control. Michelle filed the necessary legal declarations, establishing her claim formally, notifying the estate executor, preparing for objections she knew would come. And they did. Within 48 hours, Marcus called. His voice was controlled but tight, with barely suppressed anger. He said he'd received notice of her filing, that he was confused, that no one had mentioned anything about gold. She let him speak. When he paused, she asked calmly if he'd suspected the telescope contained something valuable. The question was pointed, deliberate. His hesitation confirmed what she already knew. He recovered quickly. Said, of course not. Said this was all very strange. Said they needed to meet to discuss it properly. She declined. She said her lawyer would handle all communication going forward, that any questions should be directed to Michelle Torres. Marcus's tone shifted, becoming harder. He said she was making a mistake, that she was destroying their family over money, that their uncle would be ashamed of her behavior. The accusation stung despite its hypocrisy. She asked Marcus when he'd last visited their uncle, when he'd called him, when he'd shown any interest in the man beyond what he could inherit. The silence that followed was answer enough. She ended the call. Joel reached out through text, his messages swinging between conciliation and threat. He suggested they could work something out, split the gold fairly, avoid ugly legal proceedings. When she didn't respond, he grew more aggressive. He claimed she'd manipulated the situation, that she'd known about the gold all along, that she'd tricked them into letting her have the telescope. Michelle advised, ignoring all direct contact. Any response, she said, could be used against them. Better to let the brothers communicate through her, where conversations would be documented and controlled. It was harder than it sounded. Years of family conditioning, of being the youngest and least important, of deferring to her brother's authority, created instincts that resisted professional boundaries. Emma noticed the tension, the phone calls ignored, the distraction that had become constant. She asked if something was wrong with the uncles. She said they'd been fighting, yes, about grown-up things that didn't involve her. Emma looked skeptical but didn't press. She'd learned that sometimes adults protected children by not explaining, and that pushing for answers often made things worse rather than better. At school, someone asked Emma about her uncle, about the inheritance. The question was casual, the kind that appeared innocent, but carried information gathered elsewhere. Emma, practicing the caution her mother had taught her, said only that her uncle had left some old things. Nothing special. The other student had seemed satisfied, but the incident worried her. Word was spreading. Small towns and smaller families meant privacy was always limited. Michelle called with news that was both encouraging and concerning. Her investigator had found records of her uncle purchasing gold in the 1970s, substantial quantities over several years. The purchases appeared legal, documented through reputable dealers, paid from accounts her uncle controlled. That was good. It established legitimate acquisition. The concern was simpler. The gold he'd purchased appeared to total only 4 bars. The remaining 2 were unaccounted for. Either her uncle had made additional purchases that weren't documented, or the bars had come from another source. Michelle said it probably wasn't a deal breaker. People often didn't keep perfect records, but if pressed, if her brother's lawyers demanded explanation for every asset, those 2 bars could become a problem. She thought about her uncle, about the man who'd spent 40 years looking at stars, who'd built his life around precision and careful observation. Would he have purchased gold without documentation? It seemed inconsistent with his character, which meant the bars had come from somewhere else, and until she understood where and how, their ownership remained ambiguous. Michelle suggested they continue moving forward, that establishing claim to 4 bars was better than claiming none, that the other 2 could be resolved later, or if necessary surrendered to general estate distribution. But something in her resisted that pragmatism. Her uncle had placed all 6 bars in the telescope. He'd intended all 6 for her. Splitting them seemed like accepting defeat before the fight was finished. The days accumulated into weeks. Legal filings generated responses. Responses prompted counter-filings. Michelle's office became her second home. Conference rooms where strategies were debated and adjusted, where Michelle's associates reviewed precedents and constructed arguments. The costs mounted steadily, already exceeding initial estimates, burning through the money from the bar she'd sold faster than seemed possible. Her brothers hired their own lawyer, a man named Stephen Pritchard, who specialized in contested estates. Michelle knew him, respected him, which meant the fight would be competent and expensive. Pritchard filed motions questioning her claim, demanding full estate reassessment, suggesting the telescope's contents should have been disclosed before any distribution was finalized. The arguments were legally sound. They forced Michelle to respond, to build countercases, to demonstrate that the telescope had been properly allocated, that its contents were inseparable from the object itself. The proceedings ground forward with bureaucratic slowness, each step consuming time and resources, while the bars sat in storage, inaccessible, their value locked behind legal uncertainty. Emma's birthday arrived in the middle of this. 12 becoming 13. The transition into teenage years that should have been celebrated, but was instead marked by tension and distraction. She tried to make it special, to carve out a day untouched by the legal battle consuming everything else. They went to a movie, had dinner at a restaurant they normally couldn't afford, came home to a cake she'd managed to bake despite exhaustion. Emma blew out the candles, made a wish she didn't share. Later, getting ready for bed, she asked her mother what would happen if they lost the legal case. The question was delivered with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to reveal how much the answer mattered. She sat on the edge of Emma's bed, choosing words carefully. She said they might lose some of what Uncle David had left them, that her brothers thought they deserved a share, that courts would decide what was fair. Emma nodded slowly, then asked the harder question. Would they be okay either way? She wanted to say yes. She wanted to promise her daughter that regardless of the outcome, they would survive, would find their way, would build something stable. but she was too tired for comfortable lies. She said they would manage, which was all she'd ever been able to promise, and all that had ever been true. The investigator Michelle had hired provided a report that complicated everything further. He'd traced her uncle's finances back decades, documenting income, expenses, investment patterns. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd lived modestly, spending little, saving methodically. The gold purchases in the 70s appeared to have been funded by savings accumulated over years, money set aside specifically for investment in assets that would hold value through economic uncertainty. But there were gaps, periods, where her uncle's documented income didn't quite match his expenses and savings. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested illegality, but enough to raise questions about additional income sources. The investigator suggested her uncle might have done consulting work, might have been paid in cash for services rendered, might have maintained parallel financial streams that weren't fully documented. It was plausible. Engineers with her uncle's expertise were often in demand for private projects, for assessments and analyses that needed discretion more than official paperwork. But plausibility wasn't proof, and without proof, the origins of 2 bars remained uncertain, which meant her claim to them remained vulnerable. Michelle scheduled a meeting with Pritchard, a preliminary discussion before proceedings escalated toward formal court involvement. The meeting was held in neutral space, a mediator's office designed to facilitate difficult conversations. She attended along with Michelle, facing Marcus and Joel across a conference table that felt more like a battlefield. Pritchard opened with a settlement offer. The gold would be split evenly among the 3 siblings. She would receive 2 bars outright, with the remaining 4 divided proportionally. In exchange, all parties would waive further claims, and the estate would be considered fully resolved. The offer was reasonable by any objective measure, but it required accepting that her uncle's intentions didn't matter, that his careful placement of all 6 bars in a telescope given specifically to her was irrelevant. She declined. Marcus leaned forward, his voice careful but edged with frustration. He said she was being unreasonable, that she was letting greed override family. He reminded her of their shared childhood, of how their uncle had cared for all of them equally, of how splitting the gold fairly was what he would have wanted. The argument was carefully constructed, designed to make her refusal seem selfish. She let him finish, then responded with a question. If their uncle had wanted the gold split equally, why had he hidden it in a telescope he knew only she would keep? The question landed heavily. Joel started to respond, but Pritchard held up a hand, signaling his clients to remain quiet. The lawyer's assessment was visible in his expression. Their position wasn't as strong as they'd claimed. If the case went to court, if a judge examined the specific allocation of the telescope and the brothers' later attempts to reclaim it, the outcome might favor her completely. Pritchard adjusted the offer. She could keep 4 bars, the ones clearly documented as purchased by her uncle. The remaining 2 would be split, with 1 going to her and 1 divided between her brothers. It was closer to acceptable, but still wrong. Still required accepting that her uncle's intentions were ambiguous rather than clear. Michelle advised caution. Taking 4 bars guaranteed was better than risking all 6 and potentially losing more. But she couldn't shake the memory of her uncle, carefully wrapping each bar, placing them in sequence, sealing the telescope that would protect them for decades. He hadn't left her 4 bars. He'd left her 6. The difference mattered. She asked for time to consider. Pritchard agreed, setting a deadline 2 weeks out. After that, he said, they would proceed to formal litigation, and settlement would become much more difficult. The threat was clear. Accept compromise now, or face prolonged battle with uncertain outcome. The meeting ended without resolution. Walking out of the building into afternoon light, Emma by her side after being picked up from a friend's house. She felt the weight of the decision pressing down. Everything she did next would determine not just financial outcome, but family relationships, her daughter's future, the meaning of her uncle's final gift. Emma, perceptive as always, asked if the meeting had gone well. She said honestly that she didn't know. Some battles, she was learning, didn't have clear victories. They only had choices, each one carrying costs that couldn't be fully calculated until after they'd been made. The 2 weeks before Pritchard's deadline passed in a strange suspension. Time continued moving. Obligations demanded attention, but everything felt secondary to the decision waiting ahead. She worked through the motions of her remaining cleaning job, though the hours felt increasingly surreal. She was scrubbing bathrooms while holding legal claim to wealth that could hire hundreds of people to do this work. The contrast was dizzying, and it made maintaining focus nearly impossible. Emma noticed the distraction, the way conversations would start and then drift as her mother's attention pulled elsewhere. She tried harder to be present, to give her daughter the stability she deserved, but the weight of the situation made ordinary life feel like a performance she could barely sustain. At night, after Emma slept, she sat with the settlement offer, reading it repeatedly, trying to find clarity in legal language that felt designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Michelle called midway through the first week, her tone suggesting news that would complicate rather than simplify. The investigator had found something, she said, but framed it carefully. Among her uncle's papers, stored in boxes that had been catalogued but not fully examined during initial estate processing, were letters, correspondence with someone from decades earlier, references to work done quietly, to compensation received outside normal channels. The letters themselves were fragmentary, but they suggested her uncle had worked for a private collector, someone who needed authentication services for historical items, possibly including precious metals. The work had been paid partially in cash and partially, it seemed, in items themselves. The investigator believed those two unaccounted bars might have been compensation for services rendered, essentially payment for expertise. Michelle explained the implications carefully. If those bars were payment rather than purchase, they would still have been her uncle's legal property. But the origin story would be different, and opposing counsel might use that difference to argue the bars should be treated separately from the clearly documented purchases. It wasn't a strong argument, she said, but in litigation, any uncertainty could be leveraged. She asked if the letters mentioned names, if the collector could be identified and contacted. Michelle said the investigator was working on that, but decades had passed. People moved, died, records scattered. Finding definitive proof might not be possible within their timeline. They could push back Pritchard's deadline, but delays cost money and gave her brothers more time to develop their own strategies. She made a decision then that surprised even herself. She asked Michelle to reject the settlement offer, to prepare for full litigation, to fight for all 6 bars. The choice went against advice, against pragmatism, against every instinct that had taught her to accept compromise because fighting was too expensive and outcomes too uncertain. But something deeper overrode those instincts. Her uncle had left her 6 bars, not 4, not a divided claim, but 6 complete pieces that he'd carefully hidden where only she would find them. Michelle paused before responding, the silence carrying professional concern. She reminded her that litigation would consume the money from the bar already sold, likely require selling another, might ultimately leave her with less than the settlement guaranteed. She understood. She told Michelle to proceed anyway. Marcus called that evening, his voice tight with frustration. Pritchard must have informed him of her decision. He said she was making a terrible mistake, that she was gambling their relationship, that he couldn't understand why she was being so stubborn. She let him speak, his words washing over her without penetrating. When he finished, she asked him a simple question. Had he ever really cared about their uncle, or just about what they could get from him? The silence that followed confirmed everything. Marcus recovered with protestations, with defensive anger. But the answer had already been given in the pause. She told him she'd made her decision, that her lawyer would handle everything from here. He said something about regret, about consequences. But she ended the call before he could finish. Joel tried a different approach. He sent Emma a message through social media, friendly and casual, asking how she was doing, mentioning how much he missed seeing her, suggesting maybe she could talk to her mom about being more reasonable about family stuff. Emma showed her the message, confused by the sudden attention from an uncle who'd never shown much interest before. She explained gently that Joel was trying to use Emma to influence her decision, that adults sometimes did unfair things when money was involved, that Emma shouldn't respond. Her daughter's face showed disappointment, the erosion of another illusion about family. She hated that this was teaching Emma that blood relationships meant less than she'd hoped, but pretending otherwise would only delay inevitable lessons. Michelle filed the formal response to Pritchard's settlement offer, rejecting all terms, asserting full claim to all 6 bars. The filing triggered the next phase, formal litigation, beginning in earnest. Discovery requests started flowing, demands for documentation, for communications, for any evidence that might bear on ownership. Michelle's associates worked overtime, building files, constructing narratives, preparing for depositions. The legal bills accelerated. Michelle had warned her, but seeing the numbers accumulate was different than anticipating them. They were burning through 50,000, approaching 75. At this rate, she'd need to sell the second bar soon, just to keep the case moving forward. And if they lost, she'd have sacrificed 2 bars for nothing, leaving her with only 4 and massive debt from legal fees that wouldn't be recovered. Emma's school counselor called, asking for a meeting. The request was phrased as routine check-in, but she recognized the code. Emma was showing signs of stress, difficulties concentrating, social withdrawal. The counselor was concerned, wanted to understand what was happening at home, wanted to offer support services if needed. She met with the counselor on a Thursday afternoon, leaving work early and losing hours she couldn't afford. The counselor, a kind woman named Patricia, who seemed genuinely invested, explained that Emma had mentioned family stress, something about inheritances and legal problems. Patricia was careful not to pry, but made clear that 13 was a vulnerable age, that instability could have lasting impacts. She explained what she could, without violating the privacy Michelle had advised maintaining. There was a legal dispute with extended family, over money left by a relative. Nothing that put Emma in danger, but certainly creating stress. Patricia nodded understanding, offered resources, suggested therapy services available through the school. She thanked her, took the information, knew she probably wouldn't use it, because adding one more appointment, one more obligation, felt impossible. That evening, she sat with Emma and apologized for the distraction, for the tension, for the way legal proceedings had consumed their lives. Emma, mature beyond her years, said she understood that sometimes important things required difficult attention. But she also asked when it would be over, when they could go back to normal. She wanted to promise soon, but she'd learned not to make promises she couldn't keep. She said honestly, she didn't know. The investigator called with what he framed as a breakthrough. He'd located the collector her uncle had worked for, or rather, located the collector's estate. The man had died 15 years earlier, but his records had been donated to a university library. archived as part of a collection documenting private art and historical item authentication. The records were accessible, but required travel to examine them in person. Archives policy prohibited remote access for materials of this sensitivity. Michelle arranged the trip, hired a specialist in archival research to accompany her. They flew out on a Monday morning, leaving Emma with a neighbor who agreed to cover the 2 days she'd be gone. The university was across the country, its special collections housed in a climate-controlled facility designed to preserve fragile documents for generations. The archivist who met them was enthusiastic about the collection, explaining its significance, its comprehensiveness, how the collector had meticulously documented every piece he'd acquired or evaluated. The records related to her uncle were substantial, she said, spanning more than a decade of collaborative work. Most of it involved art and historical artifacts, but there were references to metals authentication as well. They spent hours reviewing files, the specialist photographing relevant pages, making notes, building documentation that could support their case. Among the records were invoices for services rendered, notes about meetings, discussions of authentication techniques. And there, in a file dated to the late 1980s, was explicit reference to payment: 2 gold bars, 1 kilogram each, exchanged for comprehensive analysis of a Civil War-era coin collection. The specialist was delighted. This was exactly the kind of documentation they needed: clear proof that those 2 bars had been legitimate compensation for legitimate work, that they'd passed to her uncle legally, that they were as much his property as anything purchased with documented funds. Michelle was immediately informed, began preparing amendments to their filings to include this evidence. Flying home, she felt something release slightly, a tension that had been building since the discovery. Not relief entirely, because the fight was far from over, but possibility. The case was stronger now. Pritchard would have harder time arguing the bar's origins were too uncertain to support her claim. Her uncle had earned them through expertise applied ethically, through work that added value and deserved compensation. But she also felt sadness, thinking about her uncle working quietly for years. His skills valued by strangers more than family, his careful documentation preserved by institutions, while relatives fought over what he'd left behind. She wondered if he'd anticipated this, if he'd known that hiding the gold was necessary because asking his family to honor his wishes would be impossible. Marcus and Joel's depositions were scheduled for late the following month. Michelle prepared her extensively for what those sessions would reveal, how her brothers would likely frame events, what attacks on her character and decisions she should expect. They would paint her as manipulative, as someone who'd always been jealous of her brother's success, who'd seen opportunity in their uncle's death and exploited it. The characterization wasn't entirely wrong. She had been envious of her brothers, of their stable jobs and comfortable homes, of how easily life seemed to work for them while she struggled. But envy wasn't the same as manipulation. She'd taken the telescope out of respect, had discovered its contents through chance, was fighting to keep them because her uncle had clearly intended that outcome. Her own deposition came first. Pritchard was professional but probing, asking questions designed to establish timeline, motivation, awareness. Had she suspected the telescope contained something valuable? When exactly had she discovered the gold? Had her uncle ever mentioned gold in her presence? Had she discussed the telescope with her brothers after discovering its contents? She answered carefully, telling truth without volunteering information beyond what was asked. Michelle had coached her well. Pritchard tried to trap her in inconsistencies, to suggest she'd planned this from the beginning, but the factual record supported her narrative. She'd taken the telescope when no one else wanted it. She'd discovered the gold weeks later. She'd acted to secure it only after authentication confirmed its value. Marcus's deposition revealed the weakness in their position. Pritchard tried to establish that Marcus had intended to help his sister by encouraging her to take the telescope, that he'd been acting out of generosity rather than dismissal. But under questioning about his specific communications, about the jokes and disparagement, about his later pressure to remove the telescope, the narrative collapsed. He looked like what he was, someone who'd overlooked value and was now angry about missing opportunity. Joel's deposition was messier. He became defensive quickly, struggled to maintain composure when Michelle pressed about his repeated contacts, his suggestions about collectors, his attempt to reach Emma. His claim that he'd been trying to help his sister rang hollow when confronted with the timing and content of his messages. By the end, even Pritchard looked uncomfortable with his client's performance. Michelle called afterward to say things had gone as well as could be hoped. Depositions weren't determinative, but they'd established clear record of her brother's actions and motivations. If the case went to trial, and she cautioned it still might, those depositions would be powerful evidence. More likely, she suggested, was that Pritchard would advise his clients to return to settlement, this time on terms more favorable to her position. The prediction proved accurate. 2 weeks later, a new offer arrived. She could keep 5 bars outright, with the 6th split evenly between all 3 siblings. Pritchard framed it as compromise, as recognition that both sides had valid claims, that continued litigation served no one's interests. Michelle presented it neutrally, but her opinion was clear in her tone. This was significantly better than the first offer, arguably as good as they could expect without trial. She read the offer multiple times, calculating what it meant. 5 bars was most of what her uncle had left, enough to transform her and Emma's life completely, enough to make years of struggle feel like distant memory rather than permanent condition. The 6th bar, split 3 ways, would still give her substantial additional assets. Mathematically, it was victory. But it wasn't 6 bars. It wasn't what her uncle had intended. Accepting this offer meant acknowledging that her brother's legal pressure, their depositions and filings, and expensive attorney, had succeeded in extracting something from what should have been entirely hers. It meant compromise born of exhaustion rather than equity. She asked Michelle for honest assessment. Could they win all 6 at trial? Michelle's answer was measured. Probably, she said. The evidence favored their position. But trials were unpredictable. Judges had discretion. Small details could shift outcomes, and trials were expensive. They'd need to sell another bar just to fund it, maybe 2. If they lost, she'd be left with perhaps 2 bars and massive debt. If they won, she'd keep 6, but have sacrificed 2 funding the fight. The mathematics were brutal. Fighting to judgment might leave her worse off than settlement, even if she won. Michelle didn't say this was why people settled, why justice so often bent toward compromise rather than principle, but the implication was clear. Systems were designed to make fighting too expensive for those without resources, to make surrender rational even when wrong. Emma asked that evening, with careful neutrality, whether the legal stuff was getting close to finished. She was tired, Emma said, of watching her mom worry, of feeling like they were always waiting for something bad to happen. She wanted normal back, wanted to think about school and friends and things that mattered to 13-year-olds, instead of lawyers and depositions and grown-up problems she didn't fully understand. She held her daughter, feeling the weight of decisions pressing down. She could fight on principle, could risk everything to honor what she believed her uncle intended. Or she could accept compromise, take what was offered, end the stress that was affecting both of them so visibly. Neither choice was entirely right. Both carried costs that extended beyond money. She called Michelle the next morning and accepted the settlement. 5 bars outright. The 6th, split 3 ways. Legal fees would be paid from her portion, reducing her immediate access to funds but clearing the debt. The case would be resolved, documented, finalized. Her brothers would have no further claim. Whatever relationship they'd once had was effectively over. But that relationship had been built on illusions that couldn't survive honest examination anyway. The final paperwork took weeks to process, multiple signings, final documentation, transfers that moved assets from legal limbo into her uncontested control. Michelle walked her through each step, explaining what she was signing, what it meant, ensuring she understood the permanence of these decisions. The day ownership formally transferred, she went to the secure facility where the bars were stored. She was allowed to view them one final time before they were prepared for sale. 5 bars that would be converted into investments, trusts, funds that would provide security without the risk of holding physical assets worth millions. The 6th bar, the one being split, was present too. She looked at it, thinking about compromise and principle, about what her uncle had intended and what the legal system would enforce. That bar would be divided into thirds, with her portion eventually joining the others, her brothers' portions presumably spent or invested according to their own priorities. Michelle had arranged for sale through proper channels, full documentation, legal clarity. The process would take months, but the outcome was certain. She would receive approximately $240 million, minus taxes and fees, with additional amounts forthcoming from her share of the 6th bar. The number remained impossible to fully conceptualize, but its effects were becoming real. She rented a better apartment first. Nothing extravagant, but larger, in a safer neighborhood, with space for Emma to have privacy and for them both to breathe. The security deposit and first month's rent, amounts that would have been impossible before, were handled with a simple transfer that felt surreal in its ease. Moving happened quickly. Donated furniture replaced with simple but new pieces. Walls that had felt permanent, suddenly just temporary stages they were leaving behind. Emma's reaction was complex. Excitement about the new space mixed with uncertainty about what it meant. She asked, with the directness of adolescence, whether they were rich now. The answer wasn't simple. They had assets, yes, substantial ones, but those assets were being managed carefully, invested conservatively, structured to provide long-term security rather than immediate luxury. She explained it as best she could. They didn't need to worry about rent anymore, or about food, or about medical care. Emma could do activities she was interested in without checking costs first. College was secured, guaranteed, no matter where Emma wanted to go or what she wanted to study. But they weren't going to live like movie stars, weren't going to buy sports cars or enormous houses. They were going to live comfortably, securely, and build something stable that couldn't be taken away. Emma processed this seriously, then asked if they were keeping the telescope. The question caught her off guard. In all the legal proceedings, all the fighting over what the telescope had contained, she'd nearly forgotten about the object itself. It stood in the corner of their new living room, transported along with everything else, still holding the shape of having once protected a fortune. She said yes, they were keeping it. Emma asked why. She thought about it, trying to articulate what she barely understood herself. The telescope had changed everything, had revealed possibilities she'd never imagined, had connected her to an uncle she'd never really known. But it had also cost her brothers, had consumed months of stress and uncertainty, had taught Emma lessons about family and money that she'd hoped her daughter could avoid learning so young. She said the telescope reminded her that value wasn't always obvious, that sometimes the things people dismissed were the most important. Emma nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer, and asked if they could actually get it working properly, if they could use it the way Uncle David had. She said yes, they could do that. They would find someone who knew how to restore it, would bring it back to the precision her uncle had maintained, would learn to see what he'd seen in the night sky. Marcus and Joel didn't contact her after the settlement finalized. The silence felt deliberate, a statement more clear than words. Whatever relationship they'd maintained through obligation had been completely severed by legal proceedings. She felt surprisingly little grief about it. The people she'd lost weren't the brothers she'd hoped to have, just the illusions she'd maintained about who they were. Her uncle's house sold several months later, its contents distributed or discarded according to the will's provisions. She went back once before the sale, walked through rooms that had held his quiet life, tried to imagine him there, working, thinking, planning the careful deception that had protected what he'd wanted her to have. In his study, among books and papers being prepared for donation, she found a journal. The entries were sparse, dated irregularly, not a continuous narrative, but occasional thoughts recorded when they demanded preservation. She read through it, sitting on the floor of the empty room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across walls that would soon belong to strangers. He wrote about loneliness, about choices that had led to isolation, about watching his nephews become men he didn't particularly respect. He wrote about her, about noticing how hard her life was, about wanting to help but knowing that help offered during life would be refused or misused. He wrote about the gold, about purchasing it as investment, about receiving additional bars as payment, about the decision to hide it in the one place he knew his nephews would never think to look. The final entries, written in the months before his death, were about hope. He hoped she would find the telescope worth keeping. He hoped she would discover what it contained. He hoped she would fight for it if necessary, that she would prove strong enough to claim what was meant for her. He never explicitly said he'd planned it all, but the pattern was clear. The telescope, the gold, the careful construction of an inheritance that would go to the one person who'd valued him beyond his estate. She sat in that empty room for a long time after finishing the journal, crying quietly for an uncle she'd never properly known, for the loneliness he'd endured, for the elaborate gift he'd arranged from beyond death. She understood now that the gold had never been primarily about money. It had been about testing, about seeing whether she would keep something others dismissed, whether she would fight when fighting was hard, whether she deserved what he wanted her to have. She'd passed the test, though the victory felt complicated by everything it had cost. But her uncle had been right about one thing. She was strong enough to fight her brothers, to navigate legal systems, to make hard choices and accept their consequences. The money was transforming her circumstances, but that strength was something she'd always had, something he'd seen when others hadn't. The months that followed brought gradual adjustment to circumstances she still struggled to fully accept. Emma thrived in ways that broke her heart with their simplicity. Her daughter joined clubs she was interested in, took lessons in activities she'd always wanted to try, made plans for a future that wasn't constrained by constant calculation of cost. Watching Emma become the teenager she was meant to be, unburdened by premature responsibility, was worth everything the legal battle had demanded. She enrolled in college herself, part-time at first, studying subjects that interested her without regard for their market value or practical application. The experience was disorienting. Sitting in classrooms not as someone desperate for credentials that might lead to marginally better employment, but as someone pursuing knowledge for its own sake. Her classmates were mostly younger, fresh from high school, unaware how precious the time and opportunity they had was. She volunteered at organizations that supported families in situations similar to what hers had been, understanding in ways that couldn't be taught what poverty and instability did to people. The work was harder than she'd expected, facing others' struggles when hers were resolved, navigating the guilt that came with having escaped while others remained trapped. But it also felt necessary, like using the fortune her uncle had left to honor his recognition of her worth. The telescope, professionally restored, stood in a place of prominence in their apartment. They used it regularly, she and Emma, learning the night sky together, understanding gradually what her uncle had seen in those hours of patient observation. The stars, remote and indifferent, offered perspective that was occasionally valuable, reminder that human conflicts and fortunes were ultimately small against the scale of cosmic time. One evening, nearly a year after the settlement, Emma asked whether she regretted anything about how things had gone. They were sitting on their balcony, the telescope between them, waiting for darkness to deepen enough to see clearly. The question was typical of Emma, direct and impossible to deflect. She thought about it honestly. Did she regret the fight with her brothers? The destruction of family relationships that might have been preserved through compromise? The months of stress and uncertainty that had marked Emma's transition into teenage years? She said yes. She regretted those things, but she didn't regret fighting for what her uncle had intended, didn't regret proving she was willing to stand against pressure and dismissal, didn't regret teaching Emma through action, rather than words, that some things were worth defending, even when defense was costly. Emma absorbed this, her expression thoughtful in the fading light. She said she understood, that she was glad they'd kept fighting, that having money was nice, but seeing her mom refuse to back down had taught her something more important. She didn't elaborate on what exactly, but she didn't need to. Some lessons couldn't be articulated, only witnessed and absorbed. As full darkness settled and the first stars emerged, clear and steady in the urban sky, she adjusted the telescope's position, finding the focus her uncle had spent 40 years refining. Through the eyepiece, Saturn appeared, its rings impossibly delicate, its presence confirming distances that defied human comprehension. Emma looked next, gasping softly at the sight, and she understood in that moment why her uncle had spent so much time looking upward. The universe was vast and indifferent, yes, but it was also beautiful, ordered according to principles that operated whether humans understood them or not. Her uncle had found peace in that, had spent his life observing patterns that connected him to something larger than immediate circumstances. The gold had been security, had been his way of providing for her future. But the telescope had been the greater gift, the tool that allowed perspective beyond the immediate, beauty beyond the practical. She thought about the brothers who'd dismissed this instrument, who'd seen only its immediate utility and found it wanting. They'd taken what they could measure and value quickly, had walked away convinced they'd gotten the better deal. They would never understand what they'd missed, would never sit as she was sitting now, beside a daughter looking at ancient light, holding a fortune built on patience and vision and careful protection of what mattered most. The legal battle was over. The settlement was final. The bars had been sold and converted into investments that would compound over decades. But the real inheritance, she understood now, wasn't the gold. It was the permission to value things others dismissed, to fight for what seemed worth fighting for, to build a life based on something more than survival. Her uncle had given her that, wrapped in metal and hidden in a telescope no one wanted. And she had proven worthy of it, not by being perfect or wise, but by refusing to surrender when surrender would have been easier. That choice, more than any amount of money, was what would shape the years ahead. As the night deepened and more stars emerged, she adjusted the telescope again, moving toward new targets, teaching Emma the constellations her uncle had mapped across decades of patient observation. The past was settled, the battles fought, the outcomes determined. What remained was future, vast and unknown as the universe they studied, waiting to be explored with tools inherited from a man who'd understood that the most valuable things were often the ones people were quickest to discard. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.